All right, so what we're going to do here, starting out this module on the politics of the media, we are going to lay out some of the history of the media in the United States of America. And please read chapter 11 in our text at the outset. They do a great job of covering the historical evolution of the various forms of media in America, and in more detail than I'm going to provide here, okay? So please check that out. And that's really what these subsequent slides are based on, is exactly that material. So the first media in the United States, early days, right, founding era, go back to 1776, Declaration of Independence and all that good stuff, right? We had newspapers, physical, if you can imagine that, physical copies of newspapers. And note that these newspapers, much more so than today, were openly and deeply partisan. All right, so at the outset, you had two kinds of newspapers in America. You had those newspapers affiliated with the Federalist political party, and those affiliated with the Anti-Federalists, who became the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. All right, so, and you can see that. If you look at that debate over ratification of the Constitution, beginning in 1787, the editorials in favor of ratification were published in Federalist newspapers, and those opposing ratification were published in Anti-Federalist newspapers. All right. You also see the rise of a more over as the years roll by. You get the evolution of this thing called the penny press, and this was designed because newspapers used to be quite expensive. But then you get the rise of this thing called the penny press as we become a more slowly a more industrialized and mechanized society, and you get these more mass-produced newspapers that were inexpensive and available for a wider array of Americans. Now, sadly, all right, because they're trying to appeal to as many white Americans as possible, early days, they would often provide these really grotesque, deeply racist characterizations of various minority groups as threats to white people. And you have the example in our book, right, of some of these penny press newspapers grossly mischaracterizing Mexicans as a deep threat to America, therefore the need for the Mexican-American War. Which we would say in hindsight, right, that was a war fought at the instigation of America because it wanted the damn land so we could become a continental empire and a global superpower. It wasn't because the Mexicans were deeply problematic in any way. They really weren't. Not for Americans, except they were in the way, of course, right? We also see the rise of very issue-specific newspapers geared towards particular issues, whether that was suffrage for women or the burning issue of the day, right, as we march through the 19th century towards the Civil War, the issue of slavery. So you got a lot of abolitionist newspapers arising at this time, making very specific arguments about a very specific issue. So very specialized newspapers. You also get, by the late 1800s, again, right, as we industrialize with great rapidity after the Civil War, you get the rise of something called yellow journalism. I think it was the color of the paper they used. If you've ever seen the movie Citizen Kane, that's about William Randolph Hearst, who was the most successful publisher of this yellow journalism. And kind of like the penny press. It was like a penny press on steroids. It was targeted towards a mass audience of whites, and it played hard to American racism and imperialist desires. And in fact, if you look at that Spanish-American War of 1898, where Theodore Roosevelt made his bones and then later became president, with his Rough Riders and the taking of, what was it, San Juan Hill in Cuba. That was a war, right, that expressed America's desire to be a colonial power. Remember how we used to be a colony of a global superpower? Well, by about 1900 or so, we had become ourselves quite powerful, and we wanted our own colonies, hence the Spanish-American War. That was really, in part, the product of the newspapers put out by William Randolph Hearst. arguing that it was our manifest destiny to civilize people of color in places like Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Cuba, and so forth. Yeah, because Spain right by then was in decline and we were a rising power. This was kind of a big deal for William Randolph Hearst. I just read a book about that. It was quite a remarkable story to be told there. And you also get, right, as we move towards the 20th century, we also get the rise of a more objective form of journalism in the form of newspapers, right? Because that's still I think the gold standard today. We don't always meet it, right? And because we're all flesh and blood humans, we're never going to meet it perfectly. But I'm telling you, prior to the rise of newspapers like the New York Times in the late 19th century, newspapers didn't even pretend to be objective in any way at all. Right? They were completely and openly and aggressively biased in one direction or another. So although you might still take issue with important newspapers today like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, right, you would still say, but compared to where we've been, at least they aspire to some level of objectivity and work really hard to provide accurate information. Okay. So by the early 20th century, newspapers as the dominant form of political journalism in America really takes off. Probably like a post-World War I phenomenon, where newspapers become utterly dominant and massively and widely distributed across America at an affordable price. And I would say that starts to erode probably by, and I'm going to choose a somewhat arbitrary date here, probably by about 1980. The tide starts to turn against newspapers as being the apex predator in the world of American journalism. Right up to where we are today, where newspapers are by and large in a whole lot of trouble economically. So their heyday would have been from, I don't know, roughly 1920 to about 1980. Widely distributed and a major American industry in and of itself. You also get, intriguingly enough, the rise of what's called a parallel press. Check it out in our textbook. A parallel press, because I've sort of referenced, right, repeatedly, and for good reason, that most of the history of American media in the form of newspapers was really designed, right, for a white audience that was politically, socially, and economically empowered. And these are not newspapers that sought an audience among Americans of color for the most part. They really didn't. So you get, understandably, right, the rise of a parallel press designed to be, by and for people of color. Newspapers specifically by and for Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. And our book covers that very nicely, better than I can here. But some great examples for African Americans, the Chicago Defender and the Memphis Free Speech. For Latinos, El Heraldo de Mexico, and a host of other racially and ethnically specific newspapers, right? Giving rise to this idea of a parallel press to address an audience that had not previously been addressed by American newspapers. Very, very interesting. So as I've suggested before, right, America is rapidly industrializing, and it really accelerates after the Civil War. And by the early 20th century, or whoever invented it, was it Marconi over in Italy? Anyway, radio becomes a big deal here in America by the early 20th century. And then a few decades later, right, television becomes a thing and slowly comes into its own. These are radically transformative media technologies, right? Radio and television. Still a big deal today, although with the rise of the internet, in some ways a bit more marginal, but still, pretty important. A great example of the early use of radio by an elected official In this case, the President of the United States is the classic example of Franklin Delano Roosevelt giving his fireside chats via broadcast radio to reach the American people, partly to sort of boost their morale in the context of the Great Depression, but also, and related to that, right, to build public support, public opinion for his New Deal policies. So he made very effective use of radio as a new technology to advance his political agenda. And then radio, right, also becomes, of course, a form of journalism that provides critical coverage of the government. And then television, boy, what do I even need to say there? Television, still a big deal, although we'll see, we'll see in some subsequent slides that older Americans still depend a lot on television for their news about politics. Younger Americans more likely to get it from the internet. Although those two are often connected, right? Often internet news sites might be abc.com or nbc.com or cbs.com or foxnews.com or cnn.com. So it is the internet, right, but based on a television platform. Yeah, and again, right, as with radio, in some ways, right, high elected officials realize that they can use television to advance their own political careers, such as Ronald Reagan, right, the great communicator, going on national television, prime time, to give inspirational speeches about issues that he was concerned about as president, like rebuilding the American military, cutting federal taxes, or what have you. And also, right, to run campaigns. Our book makes brief mention of it. If you do a little bit of Google searching, there are some great examples of early television ads by candidates running for president that at the time, I'm sure, were considered cutting edge and very cool, and today they look incredibly primitive and quaint. And the classic one is Dwight Eisenhower, his We Like Ike. The man from Abilene! We like Ike, you like Ike, we all like Ike, or something to that effect. So again, right, as with radio, it could be used by high elected officials to either campaign or to reach the American people once in office and shape public opinion in their desired direction. But it also becomes, right, a platform that can critically cover the government, corporations, and powerful individuals as a fourth estate, as a watchdog, hopefully not a lapdog. And although our text does note there's some controversy over it, I'm not fully convinced. I still think, maybe I'm just old school, but I still think that the media, television, played a critical role in advancing the aims of the Black Civil Rights Movement. Right? Because many would argue that the genius of the movement, at its best, with things like the marches in Birmingham, Alabama, the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, King's I Have a Dream speech, right, covered heavily by television and then broadcast to a massive American audience. To communicate, right, to Americans from east to west and north to south what was going on in the South with Jim Crow, and to make an argument about what should be done about it, i.e. major civil rights legislation. So many would say that that was the genius of the movement, its ability to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience that attracted television coverage that was then transmitted to a broad audience. And that was a time, I can tell you, that we only had really 3 broadcast networks, 3 television stations that you could choose from at night. 3, CBS, ABC, and NBC. And they were all covering the movement, right? So if you were watching television at night back then, you were watching news about the Black Civil Rights Movement. You could reach back then a mass audience. Today, of course, right, the audience for media is incredibly fragmented over so many different stations and platforms. It's much harder now to reach that broad audience. All right, so as we move through the 20th century and get closer to the present, we should mention here the invention of cable and satellite television, that's dish television or cable, or of course, right, increasingly streaming. This can deliver a larger number of television stations because, again, people, believe it or not, I grew up in the era of, this is how old I am, I grew up in the era of black and white television and only 3 options in terms of viewing, maybe 4 if you got PBS, public broadcasting. A little different today, right? And that's because of the rise of, growing proliferation of broadcast television, and then, of course, the rise of cable and satellite television. And in some ways, all right, so that fragments the audience for any one platform, any one program. But also, you see the rise of what's called narrowcasting, right? Cable and streaming is really more narrowcasting, right? You don't need a huge audience of tens of millions of people to make money. You only need maybe 1 million or 2 tops, all right? So that's how CNN can make money, even though their audience is nowhere near that of the broadcast networks like CBS and NBC and ABC. Same for Fox News. So you get narrowcasting, right, where you can target narrower slices of the American consumer audience, and that has given rise, right, to when I say targeting particular chunks of the American consumer audience, I mean, right, CNN targets those who are a bit more liberal, Fox News targets those who are a bit more conservative. That's kind of a relatively new thing, right, and it's created some believe. A situation where Americans choose, and I'll emphasize that, because so often we sloppily blame the media for damn near everything. And I think, what about we the people? What about us? Should we point the finger back at ourselves, right? Because many of us choose to live in these echo chambers where we only get news that reinforces our pre-existing political views. Okay, television and the media, they're not forcing that down our throats. Right, we're making that choice ourselves. Because broadcast television, I'm going to argue, right, because they need to reach 10, 15, 20 million people. CBS, ABC, NBC, a few others now. But they need to reach a really broad audience, right? They need to appeal to as many people as possible. And to do that, you don't want to alienate either liberals or conservatives. So broadcast television, by its very nature, tends to be more middle of the road, more centrist. Cable television tends to be, by its very nature, more ideological, more segmented, more geared towards a particular demographic that creates these echo chambers that are, worrisome, right? Because in a democracy, ideally, we would all be in one big town square conversing with one another. Right, and instead we're in these ideological silos, only conversing with those of like mind politically. Pretty worrisome. You've also gotten, right, the rise of these comedy shows, often late night, that are, they're funny, for sure they're funny. And I just realized I left off Jimmy Kimmel, who's Las Vegas born and bred. Jimmy Kimmel, people like Jimmy Kimmel, Colbert, Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart, John Oliver, Bill Maher, and others. Right, they're doing comedy shows, but they're surprisingly insightful regarding our politics and often provide better information than some of the more sort of ideologically hardcore platforms. And that brings us up to the present, the modern era. The rise of the internet, and related to that, social media. And we're talking here, when we're talking about social media, the obvious ones, right, the big ones, and these are the ones I'm most familiar with. I know younger people often are aware of a wider array of social media options. But at the very least, right, we have some of the big ones: YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, now Threads, I guess, as a challenger to Twitter, which seems to be in some decline. Right, so the rise of the internet and social media have been game changers. Game changers. Right, part of it is generational. Young people far more likely to get their news from the internet and social media. Older Americans more likely to get their news from television. So quite a generational split there. What's true of the internet and social media in our politics? It's been in some ways a toxic and poisonous thing, unfortunately, because there are good things happening out there as well on these platforms, right? But in some ways, I feel like it's been overwhelmed by the toxicity and the poison. Super unfortunate, because I was there, just getting my PhD and beginning my teaching and research career right when the internet was becoming a thing. Right? So we were super optimistic as political scientists. This is going to be a game changer in a good way. It's going to democratize the flow of information. We live in the age of information. All right, looking back on it, my God, that was naive. We are living in the age of information, right? But we're often living in the age of false information, conspiracy theories, this hellscape of poisonous rhetoric, often not based on actual facts or based on limited facts, right? Anecdotal at best, often just made up whole cloth from nothing, right? and right, social media and the internet means that you often don't have editorial control over what's being put out there in the public square. And the lack of editorial control means that anyone can say anything and then publish it, right? So, yeah, I mean, that is democratic in a way, but it's also proven to be profoundly dysfunctional for our democracy. Whether it's conspiracy theories about things like vaccines or elections or any number of other things. My God, what was it? There's a database that's sponsored by the federal government, but the states are the ones who essentially run it. And it's a database about voting rolls, registered voters across all 50 states that allows them to sort of track when voters die or when they move from one state to another, and then the states share that information with one another. And that's been a great way to control voter fraud, right? Because if you vote twice in two different states, if you're in this database, it'll get caught right away. Well, some right-wing internet site published a conspiracy theory about how this ERIC database was being used for nefarious purposes by liberals or whatever, right? And now most Republican states have pulled out of ERIC because of that, right? This baseless conspiracy theory that spreads like wildfire, becomes a purity test within the grand old party. And those Republicans in red states who want a political future, right, maybe as governor or attorney general or some other high elected official, right, to have the credibility with your voter base in a red state, you've got to get your state out of the ERIC database, right, because of this conspiracy theory that was never true in the first place. And it's made voter fraud easier. It's still very rare. Right? People are generally not prone to engage in voter fraud. It's time consuming. It's risky. It's typically stupid and easily caught. Right? But when all these red states pull out of ERIC, right, it makes voter fraud a little bit easier. And what's been one of the main arguments of the Republican Party in recent years, right? The problem of voter fraud. And this makes it worse, right? But it's become this conservative litmus test in red states. Are you enough of a Trumper? Are you a MAGA warrior? Do you have the credentials? Do you buy into a conspiracy theory about a federal database? That's messed up. That is messed up. But there we are. There we are. And again, I do want to emphasize that, look, on a lot of these platforms, there's a lot of good stuff out there for we the people. Right? But I think what's developed, and this is kind of a theme, right? You're getting that, I'm sure, right? A bit of a theme. I think we need to stop just sort of vaguely saying the media is the problem. Because number one, that's analytically flabby, right? What do you mean by the media? Are you talking about newspapers, social media sites, cable television, broadcast television, newspapers. Which newspapers are you talking about? Which cable news shows are you talking about? Which social media sites are you talking about? Right? We often use it in a way that's analytically flabby, and it takes the burden off of we the people to bear some responsibility for some of the problems today with our democracy. I'm a political scientist. I'm trying to be analytically rigorous here and try to have some integrity and some sense of being, self-critical. Right? So I'm going to ask you not to buy into that analytical slop of it's the media's fault. I did notice that. And some of the comments students were making on those discussion threads, well, it's the media's fault. I'm like, yeah. I don't know about that. Back that argument up with data. And think about other possible sources of problems with our democracy, all right? And so, right, what did we see recently with Fox News? That post-2020 presidential election, they bought into all these false conspiracy theories about a fraudulent election, all right? And they came to regret that, didn't they? And then they're regretting it more with each passing day. They settled with Dominion Voting Systems for almost $800 million. And now they're facing an even bigger lawsuit from Smartmatic, another maker of voting equipment. And they're looking at either a huge jury award in that case or another big settlement. And then there's some others who are coming after them for all of their libelous and slanderous and defamatory lies. Right? But the fact is, right, they did that because they didn't want to lose audience share. They didn't want to lose audience share because they knew that Trumpers, right, ate that stuff up, and they knowingly, right, published these lies, these conspiracy theories, because they knew that their audience, that's what they wanted, right? And you even get some of that behind-the-scenes emails, right, from people like Tucker Carlson, talking about what idiots their viewers are. but they're useful idiots. They prop up the stock price of Fox News, so we're going to give them what they want. Pretty depressing, right? That tens of millions of Americans cannot critically evaluate basic information. So again, I point the finger right back at us to a significant degree. And yeah, clearly, right, Fox News bears responsibility. And they're not even the worst of the bunch, right? They were trying to prevent their viewers from going to even worse platforms like One American News Network and Newsmax and others. Because there's worse out there. Compared to them, and this is scary, Fox News looks pretty good. Oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. But it's true. So I do hold Fox News responsible for their libelous and defamatory and slanderous news programs. But I also blame, right, we the people for demanding that from Fox News. Fox News wouldn't provide it if it wasn't profitable. And in some place, that's the primary bias of the media in a free market system. And I have no problem with a free market system. But that's, in some ways, right, the core bias in a free market system in terms of media is the bias towards giving the people what they want to make a profit, even if it's false. Right? That in some ways might be the problem. And that points the finger right back at us, we the people. You can see there finally that in terms of where do we get our information about politics these days, in the year 2023 or whatever, about half of us rely quite a bit on television, mostly older Americans. About 43% get a lot of our stuff online. About 25% lean pretty hard towards radio. About 18% from lean on print, like newspapers, online newspapers and physical newspapers. Yeah, and the reason that adds up to way more than 100, right, is you might get most of your news from television, but then some of it from the radio and a little bit from a newspaper, right? You might get a good chunk of your news from television, but you might get more of it online and then some of it from the radio, right? So these overlap quite a bit. All right.